Hi, good morning, everyone. Resume hearing number 30.1 for the proposed district plan. And at this stage, we're still hearing submissions on rezoning requests for Rolleston. And just before I hand back to our submitter, anything from the 42A team for us this morning? No? All right, Ms. Appiato, over to you.
Thank you. We have Mr. Colgrave on screen. We do have a summary to hand out because there are some slight differences from his summary with the version that's in your evidence.
Great.
Fraser, we're just handing your summary out. So if you just wait a minute or two, then you can start reading that.
Sure thing, thanks.
All right, good morning, Mr. Colgrave. Thank you very much for providing your evidence to us, which we've read, but I see you've taken the trouble to prepare a summary for us this morning. So if you're happy to read that out, and then we can take questions after that, if that suits you.
Sure, thanks very much. My full name is Fraser James Colgrave. I'm an economist and the Managing Director of Inside Economics, an economics consultancy based in Auckland. My evidence provided a detailed critique of the Council's latest housing capacity assessment as required under the NPSUD. It concluded that the Council is not meeting its NPSUD obligations to provide at least sufficient capacity at all times. This is because both, one, the Council's estimates of demand for additional dwellings were inordinately low, while two, its estimates of likely capacity to meet that demand appeared overstated. When the various issues identified in my previous evidence are addressed to provide more reliable estimates of dwelling supply demand, the district clearly faces significant supply shortfalls across all NPSUD timeframes. Accordingly, additional land needs to be identified and rezoned as soon as possible to meet NPSUD obligations and to enable the efficient operation of the land market. Having concluded that the district faces significant looming shortfalls in dwelling capacity, I then assessed the likely economic costs and benefits of the proposal. Overall, I consider that the proposal will provide strong and enduring economic benefits. These include providing a substantial direct boost in market supply to meet current and projected future shortfalls, bolstering land market competition, which helps deliver new sections to the market quicker and at better average prices, contributing to achieving critical mass to support greater local retail service provision, including the community's vision for a renewed Rolleston town centre and improved public transport facility services, and the one-off economic stimulus associated with developing the land and constructing the dwellings that will be enabled there. Conversely, the main economic cost of the proposal was potential losses of rural production. However, given the site's relatively poor soils, such losses are limited. In addition, future rural production is constrained by potential reverse sensitivity from nearby land and limits on irrigation capacity. The only other possible economic cost is potential adverse effects of the two proposed commercial areas on the role and function of the Rolleston town centre. However, at only 450 square metres of gross floor area each, they are far too small to have such effects. Given the significant benefits of the proposed rezoning and noting the absence of any material economic costs, I strongly supported it on economic grounds. Two new sets of data have now become available, both of which signal even higher growth than previously expected. The first is Selwyn's official population estimate for 30 June 2022. This far exceeded expectations, with the population growing by 5,700 people in 1 year. The figure below puts this in context of past growth. Clearly, recent district growth is strong. And you'll just note there the bar on the very right-hand side is the latest growth figure. In addition to, or because of the new 2022 population estimates, new projections recently became available. Usually there is a 3 to 5 year gap between releases, but the 2021 projections were unexpectedly updated in late 2022. These new projections also signal faster growth, especially over the short to medium term. For example, the table below compares the NPSUD demand, including margins, for the 2021 and 2022 population projection releases under the high scenario, which I consider the most appropriate for planning purposes. So I'll just quickly take you through this table. So We've got the short, medium and long term on the side, and then we've got the 2021 projection and 2022. So for an example, what this says is that under the previous projections, we would be expecting medium term demand of about 10,200 additional dwellings. But under the new projection, that medium term outlook is now 15,340. So that's about a 50% increase. And also very significant increases over the short term as well. It's increased from 3,400 to more than 5,700. And also some big jumps over the long term as well. Consequently, Selwyn must begin to plan for even higher growth than previously envisaged. At the same time, the feasible capacity estimates in the 2021 HBA appear increasingly obsolete, with house prices cooling, construction prices booming, and interest rates climbing. Together, these unforeseen trend changes significantly erode development profitability and thereby invalidate the HBA's calculations of feasible capacity. Finally, I note that I do not expect the new NDRS provisions to have much impact on future supply, particularly over the short to medium term, due to higher construction costs and limited demand for such living options currently in the district. Accordingly, the conclusions of my previous evidence remain unchanged, but are strengthened by the new information presented.
Thank you. I'll see if we have questions for you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Colgrave. I don't have a lot of questions for you other than in relation to your summary, which you've just read out. Can I take you to your table 1? Just a real question of clarification for me.
Yes, sir.
You're looking at medium term, you've got 2021 projections of a bit over 10,000, 2022, 15,000. It's about a 50% increase in that projection. And then you look to the long term and the percentage number increase from the projections is a lot lower. Can you explain why that might be?
Yes, sure, sir. So Stats NZ is predicting much faster growth over the next 10 years than it previously thought, but not such a substantial change in the 20 to 30 year horizon. So really big changes to short to medium term, still some changes in the long term, but most of that change they're looking at in the next 10 years. So it's really short and medium term.
So your long term is the 20 to 30 year horizon, is it? Or is it
yeah, sorry. Yeah, these are MPSUD, so long term 10 to 30 years.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for that. And your paragraph 17 in your summary, just to unpick that a little bit more. 2021 was, if you like, boom time across the sector, increasing prices across the board, lack of availability in certain sectors and so forth. Obviously, there's been a bit of a slump. Do you see that things are going back to normality in terms of the sort of like 2014 to 2018 period in terms of housing demand? Is this it's a correction, obviously, but
yeah, look, I think nationally the whole construction sector has gone through a correction. Things really bubbled there. Interest rates were very low, and there's a whole lot of factors that were at play. So house prices across the country went up exorbitantly, including in Selwyn. And so we are seeing a bit of a tapering there in Selwyn in terms of prices, but we're not seeing a tapering in terms of consent activity or anything else like that. So I think we'll see the prices cooling off a little bit, but we're not really seeing a change in demand. But the key thing here, the point I'm trying to make is that the HBA's estimates of future feasible capacity are based on an extrapolation of what the trend looked like at that time. And I guess what I'm saying is those trends are completely broken. Even if you take sort of construction costs, they went up 15 or 16% in 1 year, whereas the HBA would have been assuming 2 to 3 to 4% like it had been for a long time. So that and the very rapid change in interest rates, when you plug those into a feasibility model, you get dramatic impacts on the estimates of the feasible capacity. So I guess what I'm saying is that the HBA's numbers are really going to be overcooking it based on these changes in those 3 big parameters. But we're still seeing that really strong demand, and that comes from the new population projections.
So in terms of long-term future planning and thinking about Rolleston, I'm pretty sure your conclusion is that there's an undersupply of available land.
Yes.
over all time periods.
Yes.
And presumably you've had a look at Mr. Sellers' figures in terms of those as well. Like I think there was agreed between the council and Mr. Sellers, there was roughly 6,500 potentially developable properties on the market in the short to medium term.
Yes.
And looking at historical growth of, say, the 2014 to 18 period referred to Mr. Sellers' evidence, wouldn't that take into wouldn't that 6,500 be sufficient in the short and part of the medium term?
No, I don't think so, sir. I'm just wondering if you possibly have a copy of my evidence from 26 August to hand there at all? My first brief of evidence?
Yes, I do. I'll just get that.
If I can just take you to table 2 in there, sir.
Make sure I've got the right one. Got your bottle as well. 5 August, table 2.
Yeah, revised dwelling supply demand estimates. Is that the one?
Yeah, just looking for the page number.
Oh, it's around paragraph
Page 12.
Yeah, no, I have it now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry, thanks for that. So if we just stay with scenario 1, because the future urban development areas get confusing very quickly because they overlap with the plan change areas. So this table was my exercise of sort of taking the HBA's figures and sort of updating them for various issues that I've identified. So if we just look at that the medium term line under scenario 1, you'll see there's a shortfall of about 6,769.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the medium term shortfall I had based on at that time. The new population projections are suggesting we're looking more at a 15,000 target for the medium term. So if I was to change that 11,819 demand figure to 15,000, then the shortfall basically becomes about a 10,000 shortfall. And so in Mr. Sellers' work, he identified 6,500 lots excluding 73, 81 and 82. So if we take the 10,000 shortfall I've just described with that new demand figure, we take Mr. Sellers' work, he's got 6,500 excluding 73, 81 and 82. If you apply that 6,500 to the 10,000, you've still got a gap of 3,500. But it's really important to remember that the numbers that Mr. Sellers come up with, which I agree with, those are sort of the long-term potential of those developments once they are completely developed to their fullest potential. So it's really important to acknowledge that over the short to medium term, a lot of these things won't get developed for various reasons. And so while the capacity might be there in theoretical terms, what really matters is how much supply there will be in the market to meet demand. And so you get things like developer intentions, you get some people who don't have the development experience, there might be land banking, there could be operational constraints, infrastructure constraints. There's all these different filters that you have to apply to the numbers that Mr. Sellers had to boil down to what you think the actual supply will be. And it'll definitely be a lot less than 10,000, which is what that sort of new shortfall target is. So even if you take all the stuff that Mr. Sellers has identified, you apply those filters to come back to a realistic market supply figure, you've still got a really big shortfall.
Okay, thank you. You seem to be of the opinion that the MDRS or the medium density provisions in the Enabling Act won't have much of an influence on all of this in terms of potential for intensification. Can you just sort of expand on your reasoning why you feel as an economist that won't be the case?
Sure. Yeah. Look, I'll preface this by saying I'm not saying that nothing will come of this. It's just that over that short to medium term, there's some sort of market changes that will need to take place before they have a really big impact. There's 2 reasons. The first one is that the new MDRS provisions really only unlock a lot of capacity if you build, reasonably high density or medium density, 2 or 3 buildings per site, a couple of stories, that kind of thing. That kind of construction is much more expensive than the single-story dwellings that have typically been provided. So, for example, GJ Gardner says it's about 30 to 40% more expensive to build a 2 or 3 story home than a single story for the same gross floor area. So it's a lot more expensive to build these taller buildings. And so from a developer's perspective, that additional cost only makes sense if there's some really big savings in terms of land costs and things like that. So in Auckland or in Australia or places with very high land prices, it's worth paying more for that construction because you get to minimise the land cost, which is very expensive. In Selwyn at the moment, we don't have land prices at a level where that equation sort of works out. So from a developer's perspective, they'll be thinking, yes, I can put more dwellings on these lots, but it is more expensive to build. I'm not going to get a huge saving on the land costs. And at the same time, and very importantly, there isn't a really strong demand from people to want to move to the district to live in that kind of dwelling. So there will be projects at the margin that start to bring a different product in, but it's not going to be a wholesale change in the capacity that's available.
Okay. I don't have any further questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Colgrave, I've just got some questions from your evidence in chief.
Yes.
So just for your paragraph 18, where is the demand within Rolleston coming from?
Where's the market, Rolleston? My experience, and this is not just Christchurch, it's essentially spillover from the metropolitan areas. So we're seeing it in Auckland, we're seeing it in Wellington, Hamilton and Christchurch. So essentially the big cities have got very expensive. COVID has forced a lot of people to rethink what they want out of life, what they want, where they want to live, how they want to do things. And so, what we're seeing in Auckland, for example, is quite a big flight out of the main areas of Auckland to the rural fringes and to the rural districts that surround it. And I think it's a similar situation here. So Christchurch City's population has stagnated over the last couple of years. It's essentially flat or gone down a little bit. And the 2 districts that flank it, Waimak and Selwyn, are flourishing. So there's a bit of demand coming from all around the country, but I think the biggest driver is relocation of people from the city.
So internal migration from Christchurch.
Yes, there's also internal migration from Auckland and other places, but it's internal migration, yeah.
I guess I'm just having a little bit of trouble reconciling your evidence with their evidence from the applicant, particularly from Chris Jones, real estate agent. And in his evidence at his paragraph 17, he said there's now some balance between supply and demand. And so there's only a need to address medium to long-term housing needs in Rolleston, which seems at odds with your evidence.
I'm not aware of the factual basis on which he's reached those conclusions. I mean, I've worked with Mr. Jones on previous plan changes. I think, someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that he's looking at that from a market perspective in terms of what he's seeing on the ground on a day-to-day basis, whether the level of inquiry sort of matches the level of availability. I'm not really sure how he would have gone about extrapolating that out over the 10-year period, sir.
Stay with me a minute. So just turning back to in your evidence in chief, your table 1, I just wanted to confirm, are those numbers for the whole of Selwyn district, or are they Rolleston specific numbers?
I believe they're the urban part of the district. It's not just Rolleston only, sir.
Right. And similarly, in your summary statement this morning, table 1, is that all of Selwyn or is that Rolleston specific?
It's all of Selwyn, sir.
Look, I think you've answered the other questions I did want to ask you, either by way of your summary or your answers to my colleagues. So no further questions from me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Mr. Sellers is next.
Yeah.
And he may be able to answer the question you asked Mr. Colgrave about what Mr. Jones is saying on the ground if you wanted to direct him.
Just a minute. Right, Mr. Sellers, good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Yeah, just checking, you've provided rebuttal evidence, is that correct? Or did you?
Rebuttal evidence, yeah, dated 13 January.
Okay. All right, and we've read that evidence, so you're very welcome though if you wish to highlight key points for us, or else we can go to questions. It's up to
Well, shall I read my summary?
Yeah, if you'd like to do that.
I'll
Ms.
just
Swan.
hand it out. Yes.
Is it different from the one?
No.
Yeah, no, okay. I've got it on screen here if it hasn't changed.
My full name is Gary Russell Sellers. I'm a director of valuation and consultancy at Colliers Valuation. I've been in that position at Colliers for 14 years. The residential property market in Greater Christchurch has experienced significant demand over the last 2 years, which placed stress on the supply of both vacant and improved product. This has resulted in significant price escalation. This market cycle is well publicised and is the result of a mixture of low interest rates and constrained supply. Since early 2022, the market has entered a correction phase following increases in interest rates and a drop in market confidence. The average annual volume of vacant residential sales in Rolleston has fluctuated over the last 10 years. Sales rose from a low of 223 sales in 2011, immediately following the Canterbury earthquake sequence, to a sub-peak of 685 in 2013, and then settled to an average of at or around 485 sales per annum for the period from 2014 to 2018. Since 2018, there has been a sharp increase culminating in 1,191 sales in 2020. The average residential section sale price in Rolleston has followed a relatively regular upward trend from 2011 until 2020. Over the last 24 months, there has been exponential growth of at least 100%. Up until early 2022, the supply of vacant residential land failed to keep pace with the ongoing level of demand. In the Rolleston market, there is only a limited number of vacant sections available for purchase. Small releases of sections in 2021 prior to the current market correction resulted in significant price escalation. The land market in Rolleston in 2021 exhibited a dysfunctional market where there was virtually no supply or choice, with uncompetitive market practices being adopted by vendors. This resulted in extreme price escalation. Developers and real estate agents report there is now reduced inquiry with marketability poor for all but titled lots. Off-plan section purchases are low. The residential section market correction is considered to be a temporary hiatus. Unless major structural changes are made to the Selwyn district land supply in the form of rezoning or intensification, I consider that the supply and demand imbalance, which existed in 2021, will resurface. Predicting the duration of the current correction phase is difficult, if not impossible, to determine. However, eventually the market will recover. The only solution to the ongoing imbalance of supply and demand is increased supply.
Thank you very much. I see we have questions for you. Lindsay, start with you again.
Thank you, Mr. Sellers. I don't have a lot of questions, but and you would have heard from Mr. Colgrave, there's a lot of figures flying around here, some of them Rolleston specific, some of them are Selwyn and so forth. But one table I did find very useful was in the appendix to your evidence, which is the joint witness statement or response to the Commissioner's minute, and the table in that which had the various different capacities that were projected.
Yes.
And roughly there is pretty similar agreement between yourself and the council experts at that stage that was produced, that there was roughly in the order of 6,500 properties potentially available. Now, in terms of looking back at historical trends, you said there was a peak in the market of 685 in 2013. And then there seemed to be a potential spike, if you like, in 2020 in terms of 1,100. And obviously predictions are fairly difficult to make in terms of uptake and on the demand side of things, dependent on a number of factors. In terms of the Rolleston itself, do you feel that the 6,500 takes into account the short and the medium potential demand at an average rate? You're looking at historical averages, or do you feel that that is still significantly insufficient over, say, the life of the plan, 10 years?
Yeah, just if I could clarify that 6,500, which was pretty well established between Selwyn District and myself, of that 6,500, there's quite a lot of potential in there that is not necessarily immediately available to the market or may not necessarily come to the market. Like you'll see in that the unzoned foeder area, which is piecemeal ownership, there's a quite a big 2,000, almost a third of the potential lots are in that category. Now, a lot of that land is currently in small holdings where it's got a house on a large site. So not necessarily, you cannot necessarily assume that they'll immediately come to the market because a lot of owners' intentions are different from developing land. A lot of it's just lifestyle. So that's the absolute maximum in terms of capacity, but it doesn't necessarily represent land that will come to the market when required.
Okay, no, that's understood, and I guess our challenge is trying to get a sense of some numbers and matching demand with supply, looking at the various different analyses which have been made, but also in terms of the potential strategic planning work that has been and potentially will be taken into the future about whether or not a particular site is appropriate for residential zoning. But I don't have any further questions of you. Thank you for your evidence. It's I think I can make an observation that there are a number of assumptions and which you've explained what those assumptions are. So thank you for that.
So I was just turning to your parent 88, which summarises the data from Appendix 3, which my colleague was just referring to. I just want to check a couple of matters. So do those figures assume development in the future at 12 households per hectare or 15 households per hectare?
They're 15, pretty sure they're 15 houses per section.
And do they take into account any implications of variation 1 in the medium density residential zoning that's been imposed?
No.
Sorry, just jump around a bit. Just going back to your paragraph 15. And say, unless major structural changes are made to the Selwyn district land supply in the form of rezoning or intensification, Just looking at that word intensification, would medium density residential zoning qualify as intensification?
I think I've covered that in another part of my evidence. I don't believe or don't consider at this stage what we know about the MDRS applications that it's going to have a major impact on Rolleston or some of the rural townships. I think I explained that in that paragraph that Rolleston is up until now has been a low density township where there's very few two-level housing or intensification. So I don't envisage that to change in the short to medium term.
So that confuses me then about the sentence that you wrote in your evidence, where you say unless major structural changes are made to the Selwyn district land supply in terms of rezoning or intensification, if medium density residential zoning does not,
Well,
in your mind,
maybe
qualify, hang on a minute, wait for the
Sorry.
question. If medium density residential zoning in your mind does not qualify for intensification, what does?
I think it's just that's probably a word that I've used loosely there, but I'm more talking about subdivision basically, and smaller lots, which has become a trend in all urban areas.
And jumping around again, just go back, we're going right down to paragraph 84 now, sorry. And your view there that any medium high density residential development of the type envisaged by the MDR will incorporate restrictive covenants. What's the basis for that opinion? Okay. So you're not saying they will do that, you're just saying they could do it. Yeah. And alternatively, they may choose not to do it. No, I think they were the only things I wanted to ask you about, so thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, I did. All right, thanks very much. Perfect. Yeah. I'll just go through a couple of key points. My full name is David John Compton-Mohan. I'm Director at DCM Urban Design Limited, private independent consultancy that provides landscape and urban design services relate to local authorities and private clients. And it was established in 2016. I did prepare a summary, but it's largely a repeat of the rebuttal evidence, so I won't go through that again. The points I will highlight, though, are the combination of the three previous private plan changes, so PC 73, 81 and 82, combined, making the west of Duns Crossing Road creates an opportunity to establish a comprehensive, well-connected urban environment. The three development areas combine to create an almost continuous block from the State Highway through to Selwyn Road, noting the wedge excluded between Burnham School and Brookside Roads, part of which is already owned for residential development. That's really the key point, actually. We've worked through the ODP a number of times through this process and working with councils, urban designers, making tweaks and refinements. But the key benefits of having the three plan changes in there has allowed us to make sure that those connections, walkways, cycleways, provision of commercial areas and provision of open space are all done in a comprehensive and well-connected manner. Duns Crossings Road itself will obviously change quite considerably and be more akin to the style that's already there by West Rolleston Road, where it already has quite an urban feel. That's a slow speed environment, especially this morning when kids are getting dropped off for school and you have road patrol out. And so that'll continue down to Selwyn Road. Those are the main points.
Good morning, Mr. Compton-Mohan. I want to take you to paragraph 24, please, and your evidence in chief. I'm really interested to understand more about how you get a degree of spaciousness in a space that's destined to become intensified. Like what techniques or how do you, if you could explain a little bit about your methodology used to determine the degree of spaciousness, we could start there.
Yes, it's largely borrowing on the public domain. There will be a change in density. Obviously, we're going from rural land to residential, but we use controls over the building placement, front yards, fencing, the landscape design of the streetscape itself, and then the placement of open space. So through those aspects, that's how we try to create that sense of spaciousness. We find on developments where we don't have controls over fencing and fencing comes right into the road edge and that boundary is clearly defined. If we can actually push that back to the building frontage, then we have that ability to create a much more open, spacious environment. So even when we do intensify and have your medium density housing in there, we still retain that character. We try to place medium density housing with open space provision, so that the residents, where they have a smaller lot size, have that ability to borrow the amenity from that open space. As you'll see through the ODP as well, we've got a number of green walkways that will provide additional links. So again, that'll help with that feeling of spaciousness.
Okay, thank you. So your paragraph 25, you talk about larger lots, or larger lots have not been proposed alongside adjoining rural properties. So what size, less than large, would be at that interface with the rural area?
So we wouldn't have any differentiation or controls over that edge in terms of having larger lots. The intention is that we recognise that potentially growth may still continue, and we don't want to create a barrier or preclude future development. In Hiranui, there's a number of developments where we look at where they have got larger lots sort of around the outside to form a buffer between that rural and residential interface.
Doesn't your paragraph 25 say larger lots have not been proposed alongside the adjoining rural area?
Yeah.
So if not larger, what size lots will go there?
Or potentially they could just whatever's permitted under the residential rules. So there wouldn't be we're not placing a restriction on that boundary. I don't think there's a need to provide larger lots so that that boundary can be treated exactly the same as lots internally within the site.
So how you get a degree of spaciousness between the rural and residential interface is again the same way that you get it by the techniques you use to create open and wide spaces.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, got
Yep.
it. Okay. Was Rolleston designed to be a satellite town?
Initially it was. I think it's got to that stage now that where it's got its own critical mass. You're starting to see retirement villages coming in as getting much more diverse in the people that are living here, but also where they work, and not everyone is commuting. So I think, and that'll continue to grow. I think it's got to that stage where it's its own thing.
So I read somewhere else, I can't remember which submission it was on, about concentric circles. So a concentric circle's related to a satellite town? No, yes.
So if it's the same thing that I think you're talking about, typically when you're looking at your designing your town, you have your commercial areas in the middle, then you have your higher density, and then it slowly sort of filters out to lower density, but that often doesn't happen in reality. There's so many different aspects that are outside of the council's control or development in New Zealand, because we have much more of a market-led approach and property rights. It tends to develop in a much more I wouldn't say random, but it's very much less that concentric development. It is starting to occur though, and it is likely that if any high density housing does start to occur within Rolleston, it's going to be more likely around the town centre.
In your paragraph, you talk about possible future connections. In terms of urban design, could ecological connections be part of the design?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. At this stage, we're quite lucky in that, or lucky or fortunate, however you look at it, that there aren't many ecological values across the site. It's open farmland. Largely, there's no native species on there at the moment. But you're right. In terms of the greenways and walkways, open spaces, we have that ability to plant them in a way that we can improve.
So, are there anywhere in the Carter Group development proposals to incorporate water races into their landscape designs?
Not at this stage, and we did look at it on other private plan changes, so the ones that's PC 75 and 78, where they had water races. Again, with the fractured ownership, it's quite difficult to. They are a nice aspect, but it is difficult to incorporate them sometimes. And I know with working on Ackland Park that they ended up. No one was using the water race actually, so they ended up filling parts of it. I think that's the hard bit. There's a lot of different parties involved in those aspects.
Oh no, that's all the questions from me. Thank you.
Just a couple from me, Mr. Compliment. When we were driving in today, we got detoured. There are roadworks south Rolleston everywhere, and we got detoured. So we were driving through a number of the more recently established parts of the Rolleston community. And I see you've done quite a lot of work in terms of the outline development plan, in terms of the structural parts of the outline development plan and so forth. Is there anything in the outline development plan which would distinguish it from what we are seeing built on the ground now, or would the intention to be a form of development similar to which has recently been built?
It would be, I understand what you're saying, and you probably got lost. Just with all the details, it would be very similar. I have noticed in other developments we do as well, our business does right down to detailed design of subdivisions. So we do get a good feel of where the trend or the fashion is going. That it'll be very similar, but it's most likely to be a mix of densities in the development, and lot size will be typically anywhere between 300, 400, 500 thousand square meter sections will be very, very unlikely. So in short, I think you will see a continuation of the type of development that that's already occurring, albeit maybe at a slightly higher density, but still standalone.
Okay, and if we haven't been through the variation one process in terms of MBREs, but general residential with no constraints on it or no qualifying matters on it, potentially you can build something significant. In terms of that outline development plan, would that be set up to take into account an increased level of development?
Yes.
Possibly anticipated through the MBREs provisions?
Yes, I think so. The key, I think, and when we looked at the road layout, and obviously when we were looking at the ODP, is coming up with a scheme plan underneath, so we can actually see that it works at that subdivision stage. Would be to ensure that the road blocks and the orientation allow for intensification without a complete redesign. If you look at some of the older subdivisions, probably from the early 2000s, their lot size and their form is much more irregular. So I would see the future developments or future subdivisions that are going in will have that ability that they can have intensification, but all the road layouts and those aspects won't need to change. They'd be able to absorb additional density.
Okay. The second question relates to where this land is on, proposed on the western edge of Rolleston. You've in your evidence, you've talked about connectivity and walkability and so forth within development, but what's your view on accessibility of the site in terms of other than local facilities, like town facilities, but not your corner shop or your takeaway, or your local school? Do you know the distance, say, from midpoint to Rolleston town centre from the site?
It's a few kilometres, so it's not, you wouldn't walk that distance. You'd be a 45, probably half an hour, 45-minute walk. So they are quite large distances. As you mentioned, the local connectivity and day-to-day provisions are set up so we can minimise the car usage for those short trips. It's well provided for in terms of schools, and there will be for open spaces, cycling and scooter movement,
provision will be really, really good, and that is beauty of being in a flat area. So the ability to bike into central Rolleston is good, but there will be some aspects where they are reliant on private motor vehicle use. In terms of getting into Christchurch, it's very accessible. They'll be straight on the motorway and into the city.
Yeah. With the growth of Rolleston, there has been, if you like, the town centre identified and things going out potentially in concentric circles from that. When a township gets to a certain critical mass, is there a need to look at other town centre type facilities, but in other parts of the conurbation?
I think, yes, those smaller supporting centres, I think that was part of the thinking behind increasing the size of the commercial area on the Brookside Road, Duns Crossing intersection. That Duns Crossing Road will be quite a key movement corridor as people come off State Highway 1. And so there is a need to provide more than just a dairy and a hairdresser and a fish and chip shop, in my opinion, but not to the scale where then it starts to compete with the town centre.
So there's sufficient flexibility in the ODP to potentially rejig the blocks allocated to non-residential use?
Well, I think so. I always think an ODP's sort of your overall framework or guide, but it needs to have that flexibility that you can make changes later on as the market changes. Or one beauty though is that with this site that it's all in one ownership, so there's a lot higher level of control.
Okay. And last question is there's been a lot written, in fact, all the way through these hearings about the MPSUD and the need for well-functioning urban environments. And if this plan change was to be approved and get a residential zoning, your view is that this is on a scale from acceptable to really good. What would your view be in terms of this proposal and the remainder of Rolleston becoming a well-functioning urban environment?
I think on the neighbourhood level, I think it's really good. Just noticed that this morning driving around, there's a lot of people walking their kids to school or biking. So in terms of future residents being able to go about their day-to-day activities, I think it's a very good chance that it'll be a well-functioning urban environment.
Okay. Thank you.
Just one follow-up question in that regards. I don't have any questions regarding well-functioning urban environment in terms of the outline development plan and the land that's the subject of this proposal. What I'm interested in is a wider context of Rolleston as a whole. And so I've been looking in your evidence for anywhere where you address that in terms of this contributing to a well-functioning urban environment and the overall Rolleston context. And I'm looking at your paragraph 46.3. Is that the right place I should be looking for an answer to that kind of question?
A lot of those aspects were dealt with Nicole Rolleston, and it was sort of a conscious choice that Nicole would look after the sort of the more macro
right
aspects, and then I'd dive into the more neighbourhood aspects.
So you focus mainly on the neighbourhood stuff.
Yes.
All right, that's good. Thank you.
I just wondering if I just might make one comment about Commissioner Dage. This would work with MDRS. This was the outline development plan produced at PC 81 and 82, showing how it integrated with PC 73. Just to remind you, 81 and 82 were notified after the Enabling Act, and at Council's insistence, they were amended to include MDRS. So those plan changes, 81 and 82, did already incorporate MDRS. So the ODP was prepared on that basis. 73 was notified prior to the Enabling Act, so missed the MDRS. I wrote to Council saying that under clause 34 of that Act, they were required to vary PC 73, and they didn't. But this is prepared on the basis that it would work with MDRS. So if that helps. Finally, last but not least, Mr. Phillips, who does have an updated summary.
Right, good morning and welcome.
Good morning. If I take you through my latest summary, and perhaps take paragraphs, paragraph 1 is read. Paragraph 2, I just note that more fulsome summary of my evidence was set out in my rebuttal evidence. I don't repeat that here. The purpose of this updated statement is to address the rebuttal evidence of Mr. Thompson for submitters 456 and 344, and the rebuttal evidence of Mr. Lightbody for the council and regional council.
Yeah.
And also to address the hearing commissioner's report, which was issued on Friday. So in terms of Mr. Thompson, I note that paragraphs 29 to 33 of his rebuttal evidence address the section 42A report on highly productive land and the recommended changes to the urban growth chapter to give effect to the MPS HPL and strengthen the relationship with the MPS UD 2020. In this case, the subject land isn't HPL, so it's of HPL are of limited direct relevance to these proceedings or the submission, but I agree with Mr. Thompson's sentiments in regards to UGP3 and UGP9 for the reasons he stated. More relevantly, I also agree with Mr. Thompson's conclusion that the proposed plan rezoning hearings, for those the key issue is the suitability or not of rezoning, whereas for the variation, the key and the secondary issue in my view is the appropriate density of development on land that is in a relevant residential zone. For the rebuttal evidence of Mr. Lightbody, at paragraph 8.2, Mr. Lightbody states that there is no directive in the RMA or the MPSUD to enable anything more than expected demand. It's factually correct, but I do consider that it negates the clear and intentional directive and policy 2 of the MPSUD to at all times provide at least sufficient development capacity to meet expected demand. I've added emphasis there. Noting my view, the general thrust of the MPSUD is to take an enabling rather than constrained approach towards housing supply, which I've discussed further in my evidence. Also, despite the more recent evidence of Messrs. Colgrave, Sellers and Jones, which concludes otherwise, Mr. Lightbody relies on the July 2021 HBA to conclude that across the Greater Christchurch urban area, a healthy excess capacity exists of 46,700. Mr. Lightbody also considers that the incorporation of MDRS into all relevant residential zones within the district will enable far greater intensification within Rolleston, Lincoln and Prebbleton moving forward, which will reduce the model shortfall. However, this conclusion overlooks the evidence of Mr. Sellers and Mr. Jones, and I note also Mr. Colgrave, that intensification will not to any meaningful extent substitute demand for the needs in terms of type, price and location of different households. And it assumes widespread implementation and adoption of MDRS, despite the current situation in Christchurch City, which indicates significant resistance from the community and elected members and potential rejection of these standards through the extensive use of qualifying matters. So the key point there is that process is still yet to play out. In my view, Mr. Lightbody also disregards the distinct needs in terms of type, price and location of different households, i.e. same locality and market considerations in table 4 and paragraphs 8.6 and 8.10 of his evidence, and is overly optimistic as to the actual delivery of the potential supply provided for by zone land, just pausing there, that was a matter that Mr. Sellers touched on around that supply versus what will actually come to market. So specifically, the concerns I have is that in table 4, he aggregates the supply of housing in various plan changes at various stages and varied ownership, notably there in terms of appetite or capability to develop in different parts of the district, and he assumes full delivery of the potential number of lots referred to in these plan changes. Paragraphs 8.8 to 8.10, Mr. Lightbody accounts for the potential development capacity provided for within Christchurch City or Greater Christchurch as a whole, and at paragraph 8.11 cites concerns with a consequential effect on the uptake of intensification opportunities, despite these being distinct localities and markets. So in summary, and accounting for the evidence of Mrs. Colgrave, Sellers and Jones especially, I do not support Mr. Lightbody's reliance on the residential growth modelling undertaken by Greater Christchurch Partnership or as a resulting conclusions. In terms of the recent recommendation on PC 81 and 82, report and recommendation, as you're well aware, was issued on Friday. Recommends that council decline both of the plan changes. I've set out in full the overall conclusion. I can have that taken as read, assuming you've read it.
Yep, we've read that several times.
So going to paragraph 12, where I sort of touch on the key findings of the decision that in my view support the rezoning submission here. Sort of summarised from above, they are over the page at 12.1. The effects of the rezoning on the environment are generally found to be acceptable and are able to be appropriately avoided, remedied or mitigated. However, reverse sensitivity and urban design / urban form related effects warranted further specific consideration. Much the same conclusion as the decision on PC 73. On these matters, in terms of reverse sensitivity effects, I remain of the view that a 600-metre buffer from the recovery park remains appropriate for the reasons set out in the evidence of Mr. Van Keekum and Mr. Assali. In conjunction with the other measures proposed in the outline development plan to avoid reverse sensitivity effects, I consider the rezoning request will be consistent with the policy that I've noted there, which specifically concerns reverse sensitivity. In terms of urban design or urban form effects, the ODPs were concluded to deliver a generally appropriate development structure. However, the decision stated that the best outcome would be achieved through consideration and integration of the PC 73 land to the north and the whole of the block west to Edwards Road, and a more strategic assessment of alternative growth options to the west, southwest and southeast of Rolleston. So the key point there is there wasn't so much of a concern over the ODPs themselves and how they functioned, it was more how they knitted them with surrounding land and to what extent that process could consider surrounding land and sort of that bigger macro picture. In my view, the proposed plan rezoning hearings specifically allow for consideration of the full block, noting the extent of the ODP in the submission and its linkages with surrounding land, and reliant on the evidence of Mr. Compton-Moen and Ms. Launstein, I consider it will achieve an appropriate urban form outcome at both a localised and Rolleston-wide scale that achieves relevant urban growth objectives. To the extent that alternative options for growth around Rolleston warrant further consideration, I address this in further detail below. Appropriate infrastructure is able to be provided, or the decision concluded that appropriate infrastructure is able to be provided for the PC 81 and 82 proposals, albeit the establishment of required water supply and transport infrastructure will likely mean the majority of proposed development capacity is practically enabled in the medium term. So in simple terms, it will take time to get that infrastructure in place, and the development will be waiting for that to be in place before it commences. The decision also noted that the proposed operative plan provisions, which have obviously been adapted for the purposes of the proposed district plan and these proceedings, will work through such that they would stand scrutiny against other provisions options in terms of the Section 32 evaluation. In terms of key reasons or findings for the recommendation of decline of 81 and 82, they concern firstly the timing of development capacity that would be enabled relative to the remaining lifespan of the operative plan. The decision noted that the best that might be expected is that the consenting of the first stage of development would occur through that remaining lifespan. In my view, that's clearly not an issue given the 10-year horizon of the proposed plan, and noting the evidence of Mr. Colgrave that a shortfall in capacity will arise within this timeframe. Appreciating that there's some uncertainty as to exactly when that will transpire. The decision also was concerned about integrated management in terms of a more comprehensive assessment of other options for growth at Rolleston. On this point, the Commissioner's report stated that a process enabling a more comprehensive assessment of the wider location against other options through the proposed district plan hearings and emerging spatial plan may reach a different conclusion. And at paragraph 246, the recommendation noted that whilst this location is on the evidence a good candidate for long-term greenfield growth, if pursued in a comprehensive and integrated way, there are other potential locations which have not been tested. The relative merits of those areas have only been given scant comment, and the risk of acting is therefore clearly that this infers at least a commitment to a strategic area of growth which may not be the best strategic option. Conversely, I do not consider there are material risks of not acting, given this matter will come before the proposed district plan hearings in the near future. So in response to that, I note that the proposed plan process does have a wider lens, accounting for the larger spatial extent of the rezoning that's requested by this submitter and the other submissions before you that are seeking urban rezoning of other land that adjoins the Rolleston township. So as to these alternative options for urban growth, attachment 1 to this, I should say summary, provides an assessment of the relative merits of these, noting that the assessment of alternatives to date has focused more on the process rather than the outcomes or locations for growth. And whilst this analysis is brief, I consider it signals clear relative benefits of this requested rezoning and its greater efficiency and effectiveness when contrasted to alternative options. So the evidence that I've presented and rebuttal evidence presented to you to date has sort of touched on some of those constraints in terms of HPL and air noise contours. And this really just goes into a little bit more detail around some of those areas to the east, southeast and south of the Rolleston township especially. Accounting for that assessment and my previous assessment of the merits of awaiting a future spatial planning process, I consider that the requested rezoning is the most appropriate option for providing both growth, both in terms of potential locations and process. To answer any questions.
Do you just want to take the Commissioner through your appendices and in particular the map at page 11, how it relates to your table?
Sure. So actually, if you turn to the final page, you'll see a map of Rolleston, which will have appeared in other briefs of evidence that you'll have already seen. The key difference here is that I've sort of clustered so the geographical areas for potential growth. Option 1 to the north, I've discounted for fairly obvious reasons, which I'll touch on the table. Option 2 to the northeast, the notable feature of that is HPL and air noise contours. Option 3 to the southeast, the notable feature is HPL. There's also fragmented land ownership when you get into the detail of that. Option 4 to the south is partly HPL and partly not HPL. The key feature there is the Gammock estate, which I can elaborate on, but it's land held in trust. I understand that the owners there haven't submitted seeking any rezoning, so there doesn't appear to be any sort of appetite to rezone or develop that land in the foreseeable future. And option 5 to the west is obviously the land we're dealing with in these submissions. The tables that precede that figure essentially go through each of those options and look at the relative benefits, advantages, costs, disadvantages, efficiency and effectiveness of achieving the objective of extending Rolleston and delivering significant development capacity and providing increased competition and choice.
Perhaps just if you could, and the commissioners may know this, do you know off the top of your head where there are other rezoning requests that are before the commissioner in relation to these options? Presumably there's none in option 1.
So option 1, no, there's no residential rezoning. Obviously there's a rezoning request for industrial land and PC80 that's indicated in blue in the figure. Certainly no indication of any desire for residential intensification. Option 2 to the northeast, there was one submitter with a relatively large block of land within that air noise contour that filed a submission seeking residential zoning. But
That's being heard on Thursday.
yeah. Option 3, I think I'm aware of a submitter seeking 1 acre lots of rural lifestyle intensification, but I'm not aware that they followed up with evidence. And as I say, option 4, I'm not aware of any submissions in that location seeking residential rezoning. Yes, sorry.
Thank you. I see we have questions for you. Raymond, any questions?
Just one. Good morning, Mr. Phillips.
Morning.
I've got one question, and it's regarding your evidence in chief and your assessment of the NPSUG. The policy 1A talks about Māori being able to express their cultural traditions and norms. In what way you've done an assessment on that? So in what way how did you arrive at that and say that that particular box could be ticked?
So at the outset, with plan change 73 and then with 81 and 82, the plan changes were circulated to Mahanui Kurataia for comment. I think from memory, that because it's going back a while, they provided some feedback that part of which was incorporated, part of which was acknowledged, but there weren't direct responses. I think there were concerns, as you probably touched on, around treatment of the water courses and any sort of fauna or flora that might be within those. I think Mr. Compton-Mowen's response to that was that there weren't sort of specific provisions relating to that there are actually within the ODP. There's some text requiring at the time of subdivision an ecological assessment. In terms of housing, there probably hasn't been anything specific in response to things like Papakainga housing, but I think it's not precluded. There's a variety of the zone provisions by their nature, I think, provide for a variety of sort of housing type and choice. So that's probably the extent to which that's been catered for.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Look, I don't have a lot of questions. You've appeared before us on a number of hearings already, including urban growth, strategic directions, and various of the different zoning chapters. So I think your position to me on the NPSUD is quite clear. What I was interested in is your comment and your the evidence you presented us to today in terms of giving an assessment of where other practical development capacity, greenfield development capacity might be around the edges of Rolleston. Is that entirely your own work, or is it come from out of Genesis somewhere else, or is it just what you know, or have you had a discussion with the council about that?
No, it's my own work. I'm informed by the evidence that I've relied on, so it hasn't been tested by council officers. I think the assessment is, as you'll see, relatively brief and to the point. I haven't delved. I've talked with other witnesses around any obvious, say, for example, infrastructure constraints or transport constraints, and in the time available, haven't delved into those. But I don't think that detracts from the overall conclusions and probably the obvious cost benefits, constraints and advantages. And again, those principally relate to HPL, air noise contours, fragmented ownership versus large areas of ownership, and clear sort of appetite or willingness to progress development. So I think the fact that these plan changes have been through a process and have been tested, and someone's clearly indicated a willingness to get on with it, and some of those alternative locations that's not there, and that's key in terms of when that development capacity in those other locations might actually be realised. Because I think if the option of waiting for a spatial planning process to go through and test those options and see what what might suit. They may come to the same conclusion, or in my view, they most likely come to the same conclusion and end up back at the same point. And in the event that they enabled zoning in those locations based on the information and before me around the constraints with that land, I don't have confidence that they will deliver housing anytime soon. And I think when that's contrasted with Mr. Colgrave's evidence and concerns around when the current supply is going to effectively run out, and you're going to need a supply. I think that's where that becomes quite important. So that's where I ultimately land in terms of saying that's why I think this option is the most appropriate one, and also from a process point of view, awaiting a spatial planning process may well be moot.
Okay, there's a couple of things there. So your summary is that in terms of Rolleston and the areas that you've looked at around the edge, all the others are too hard. So therefore you should point to west of Duns Crossing Road.
In a nutshell, yes. Obviously, there's a lot more detail to that, and I think again, stepping back from that, I think again the evidence paints a clear picture that in terms of say the likes of Mr. Jones and Mr. Sellers and Mr. Colgrave to a degree, is that there is demand for the housing type and location that Rolleston offers that won't be substituted by NDRS within Rolleston. It won't be substituted by alternatives in other parts of Greater Christchurch. To the extent that it might be substituted, there's evidence from Mr. Jones that people tend to go further out if they can't find things at the right price point in Rolleston. So to me, there is a demand that needs to be met in Rolleston. So that for this typology of housing, therefore the question is, where do you go on those fringes? And you've only got sort of those three directions you can go.
Okay. And a follow-up question from that, we talked about future spatial planning processes being the guideline about where and how and things should go on the basis of various assumptions. Are you opposed to the spatial planning process, or you just opposed to, or just of the view that it's not necessary in this instance because the evidence on behalf of your client is that
No, not at all.
land is great?
No, not at all. I think it's just a timing issue that it's struggling to keep up, and that's probably a consequence of the exceptional rate of growth that's occurred and the dynamics that we've seen in housing markets generally, and in this part of Greater Christchurch in particular. But I think that spatial planning process has and is still struggling to keep up. And in terms of the time frame going forward, and I've talked about that in my evidence, that the outcome, as I understand it, following the spatial planning process, is a review of the RPS and amendments at that point to the district plan. That when you look at that and then you overlay that or compare that to the timeframes when housing is needed, it's going to be too late, bearing in mind that by the time that the certainty of where that growth might go through that process, there are all those precursors in terms of roading infrastructure upgrades and land acquisition. So I just think it's just too slow. I don't have a problem with it.
So yeah, so normally in planning 101, as you look at the big picture first, you look at the constraints, you look at the big picture first, and then you gradually refine it right down to a proposal that deals with, for example, a piece of land and what you might do with that piece of land in the future. So you're saying the current processes which are being mooted for Greater Christchurch are out of time, or out of kilter in terms of time with the realities on the ground. That's my understanding of the fundamentals of.
Correct, not responsive enough.
Not responsive in accordance with what the NPSUD wants you to do.
Yeah. And I think as an observation, I mean, I think in some respects, the process that a spatial planning process goes through in terms of looking at where demand is and what needs to be catered for and what the different options are and feasibility of those options is essentially what probably the submitter has done in this case from a development perspective. I appreciate that doesn't involve the same consultative process that a spatial planning process has done, but in some ways we've almost started from the bottom up saying, does this land work? And then you take a wider lens and then you come back down to focus on it. So that's why I've referred to that spatial planning process potentially being moot and getting us back to the same point.
Yeah, but very much depends on the assumptions though, doesn't it? Going into what growth is and where it's needed.
granted, albeit.
And, you know, and we're seeing something, you know, the heady days of 2021 are over, aren't they? In terms of, I see Mr. Carter's, and on a cyclical basis, but in my experience as a planner, it was probably more of a spike in 2021 than I've ever seen in terms of house prices and land availability.
I'd grant that, but I'd also say that, I mean, I think prior to 2021, Rolleston on the evidence has shown exceptional levels of growth. Mr. Colgrave touched on that sort of trend in metropolitan centres of people looking to move out of, you know, denser, more expensive living environments to a type of housing that's in peripheral areas where they can have more space, things cost less, or they're even moving out to sort of rural areas. And I think that's what, in terms of the evidence I'm seeing, is what's driving growth here and places like Waimakariri district. And that doesn't seem to be something that appears to be, there's nothing suggesting that trend is going to disappear.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Nothing more from me.
Thank you.
I've just got one long-winded question for you, so bear with me. Obviously, we have a policy framework with quite directive provisions in the regional policy statement regarding urban growth. And we accept in its dollars they're tempered by the MPSUD in terms of being responsive, etc. Also have evidence before us that there's 6,500 currently available lots within Rolleston. There's debate about how realistic they are, but that's the evidence in front of us. There's concern or speculation about the rate of uptake in the approved plan change areas 70, 71, 75, 78, and also how quickly land within the urban growth overlay might be developed. We also have the new medium density residential zoning through variation 1 across the whole of Rolleston. So given that context and the currently available supply of the 6,500 vacant lots, why wouldn't it be more appropriate to wait and see how the medium density residential zoning plays out? And wait and see what the greater Christchurch Partnership spatial planning exercise results in, and any consequential changes to the very directive regional policy statement provisions. And given my understanding from the evidence that any housing supply within the proposal in front of us would not be available in the short term, 0 to 3 years, I'm struggling to see why we wouldn't wait to see how everything else already in play plays out before considering the appropriateness of this land for residential zoning. It's a very long-winded question, but did you capture the gist of that?
Yes. And I can probably give a reasonably long answer. I think the short answer is, my views as I've expressed is that I see that the MPSUD promotes a more enabling proactive approach rather than a more conservative reactive approach. So I think that's an overriding consideration. But I think in the discussion this morning of the questioning, I was sort of going through and trying to capture some of the key points from those experts in anticipation of this question. And what I've sort of set out is, firstly, and it repeats some of what I've said to Commissioner Dash, but Mr. Jones's evidence and others has expressed this demand for this particular product and market in this location of Rolleston, and has concluded that intensification is not a substitute. Mr. Sellers has indicated that there's in the order of 6,500 potential lots in this area, but they may not actually be realised because it will depend on individual landowners and how that plays out, and that medium density residential standards won't make a big difference or a material difference in terms of supply. Mr. Colgrave has concluded that the HBA figures are inadequate and woefully low, and that by the same token, the supply is overestimated in the work undertaken to date, and which has been relied on, and demand considerably underestimated. So and I think through the experience of PC 73 and 81 and 82, even council's experts, there was no debate that more will be needed in the 10-year life of this plan that we're talking about. So if we're talking about a 10-year horizon for this plan, I don't think there's any debate. More housing will be needed than is currently provided for. Perhaps that's in the short term, perhaps it's in the medium term. That's probably where the uncertainty arises in terms of what assumptions are made regarding delivery of supply and demand and population projections. But I think there seems to be consensus it's there or thereabouts in terms of that early medium term. So there needs to be a solution, in my view, to that shortfall. In terms of those solutions, as I've said, medium density residential standards don't seem to be a solution in this location, per the evidence of Jones Cellars and Colgrave. The other areas on the fringes of Rolleston, I've touched on the reasons why I don't consider they're valid options in the summary that I've provided you today. We've discussed awaiting a spatial plan to see what options they might come up with for that, again, particular market and demand. But again, my concern is that that's will be too slow and well into the life of the plan, and the risks that the market here is caught short again in terms of available supply, and you get exactly the problems that the MPHUD is trying to avoid, or you may end up with the same result that they point back towards the land that's before you in the submission. The other key point I understand from Mr. Colgrave's evidence is there's no economic costs of rezoning the land. So that's I think that's quite important, because in terms of that precautionary principle, or what if we get it wrong by rezoning this land, I think there's some comfort there from Mr. Colgrave's evidence that there's no significant economic downside to doing that. It may do to some extent. So I think obviously the more development that occurs, the more infrastructure is required in terms of road network upgrades. Some of the rules that as they've been developed have prerequisites in terms of road network upgrades occurring. Some of those are probably quite straightforward conventional upgrades that would normally occur through a subdivision and may not be subject to delays. Others might rely on NZTA, sort of Wakatahi, to progress works, albeit they're well underway. So I think what I'm saying there is, if there was the demand, if the significant majority of development that would be enabled by this rezoning, in practical terms, once you allow for that infrastructure to come on stream, that's going to be in the medium term. Yeah, but I think again that is when the evidence is saying that additional supply is really going to be needed, but you've got to move sooner rather than later to get things in place for that to occur. Yeah, yes, per the MPHUD.
My mic on, and I did have a question about I missed my big long rambling question. Anyway, so the proposed amendments to the PDP that are attached to your evidence, I did have a question about, they appeared to be based on provisions that included medium density residential zoning, rather than what's currently in the proposed district plan.
Right. And
I was confused about that, because our job is to consider changes to the proposed district plan, not changes to a proposed district plan that reflects MRZ provisions that aren't kind of in front of us.
Yeah.
Can you help me with that?
It's a fair,
81, 82.
Yeah. yeah, it's a fair question actually, because I think the way that this process has evolved is sort of going from 73 to 81 to 82 to this, and it's quite simply probably an oversight in terms of those provisions reflecting where we were at with 81, 82. So
But that's not in front of us, is it?
yeah, acknowledge that. So whether that's a matter that need, off the top of my head, I don't know to what extent revisions will be needed to reflect that. I don't imagine it would be a significant issue, but there may certainly be drafting changes required.
We can check that.
But they can be checked. Yeah, I can check that.
Yeah, this was a point before 81 and 82 was at NDRS. So we've obviously picked that up and haven't realised
Mm.
that when we come here, we've got to go backwards because our submission didn't,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll have a look at that.
Mm. I think I would say on that the substance between, because obviously the PC 81, 82 provisions evolved from the PC 73 process, which didn't have that MDRS, there weren't significant changes. So I wouldn't imagine significant or material changes. I think it's more just appropriate drafting.
All right. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
No further questions from me.
Thank you. That's it from us.
All right, thank you very much. So we're now adjourned for the rest of the day. We'll reconvene at 9 AM on Thursday.
Yes, now, I'm up on Thursday,
You are?
this thing with the airport. I've said an hour and a half, it may not be an hour and a half, given the speed at which we're going through this. That matter doesn't have the jurisdictional matter that we dealt with at the start of this. Does have HPL, but yeah. So I wouldn't expect that I'll need as long as I thought I'd need for legal submissions.
Yep, no, I agree.
We probably won't be an hour and a half. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think I've already asked the council staff to liaise with you and reduce the original half a day down to less than half a day.
Yeah,
and
so
that
we've
date
already been
for
down to an hour and a half, but it may
Yeah.
be not even that, so.
Yeah, and they've already got other submitters coming in earlier. I'm not sure to what extent we can get them to come in even earlier, but we'll just see how that plays out. Thank you.